Jetzt dürfen wir uns unserem ersten Referenten von auswärts zuwenden. Ich möchte kurz eine Vorgeschichte erzählen. Verschiedene Schweizer Medien titelten im Jahr 2008: Verschwörungstheoretiker bekämpfen biometrische Pässe. Das waren wir. Tagesanzeiger hat darüber berichtet. St. Galler Tagblatt schrieb: Oft benehmen sich solche Gruppierungen weltfremd und leiden unter Verfolgungsängsten. SRF Rundschau ergänzte: Sasek glaubt, der Chip im Pass sei nur ein erster Schritt. Früher oder später werde der Chip sogar unter die Haut eingepflanzt. Nun, 17 Jahre später, ihr Lieben, wird uns Professor Dr. Daniel Broudy von der Universität Okinawa aus Japan in Pläne, in Praktiken und Prozesse einweihen, die sogar die Umwandlung des gesamten Menschen von einem natürlichen, souveränen Wesen in eine synthetische und kontrollierte Form des Lebens vorantreiben. Ja? Also nicht bloß Chip unter die Hand. Er weiht uns überdies in die Mechanismen, Methoden und Wege ein, wie der Mensch, der gesamte Mensch in seinem Wesen verändert werden soll. Er wird uns auch nicht im Unklaren darüber lassen, welche Sorte Mensch mit welchen Unternehmen verbandelt an der Umsetzung dieser Horrorvision oder dieser Horrorpläne und Prozesse werkeln. Ich sage danke, Professor Broudy, dass Sie heute an der 21. AZK Ihr kostbares Wissen mit der betroffenen Menschheit teilen. Aber vorab noch Ihre Kurzbiografie.
Professor Daniel Broudy, geboren 1964 in den USA, hat einen Doktortitel in angewandter Psycholinguistik und Erfahrung als Bildanalyst. Er hält Vorlesungen zu Themen, die von Kommunikationstheorie über visuelle Rhetorik bis hin zu linguistischer Komposition und rhetorischer Grammatik reichen. Professor Broudy war Dekan der Graduiertenschule für interkulturelle Kommunikation an der Okinawa Christian University in Japan. Er ist derzeit Professor für angewandte Linguistik. Seine Forschung konzentriert sich auf Klänge, Symbole, Zeichen, Bilder und Farben und wie diese von Machtzentren als Werkzeuge eingesetzt werden, um Wissen zu formen und die Wahrnehmung und Emotionen der Menschen zu beeinflussen. Er ist Mitherausgeber von Propaganda im Fokus, Mitherausgeber von Das Propagandamodell der heutigen Zeit, Wahrnehmung und Bewusstsein filtern und Mitautor von Okinawa unter Besatzung, McDonaldisierung und Widerstand gegen neoliberale Propaganda. Eine Auswahl seiner wissenschaftlichen Arbeiten findet sich auf ResearchGate, der weltweiten Datenbank für Forscher aus allen Bereichen der Wissenschaft. Professor Daniel Broudy ist assoziierter Forscher der Arbeitsgruppe für Propaganda und für den durch den 11. September ausgelösten globalen Krieg gegen den Terror. Professor Dr. Broudy spricht heute über Transhumanismus und Posthumanismus. Wer strebt danach und wo stehen wir heute in der Entwicklung?
Well, thank you so much for the invitation and the warm welcome. And greetings from Japan. How should we say it? Guten Morgen. And we say Ohayo gozaimasu, yoroshiku onegai shimasu. Yoroshiku onegai shimasu is kind of like, please be nice. I don't know if there's an equivalent in German, but so yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. I've prepared to talk today about transhumanism and posthumanism. So it's slightly technical at times, but I've tried to make it appealing to a wide audience. So if I can begin with this headline here. Here's a quite interesting headline. Artificial wombs are coming soon. This is the part of the biotech narrative that is now being heard around the world. And of course, the subtitle, Are We Ready for Their Effects? Well, to me, this looks kind of like warfare, more shock and awe, typical of a kind of a rhetorical blitzkrieg on our psychological states. Seems to me the sheer audacity of the anti-human headline begs even larger questions. Are these sorts of anti-human projects, are they part of some larger move in transhumanism? Or could we say even posthumanism? To locate some answers, we need to turn to other related narratives. Since the rollout of the coronavirus story, and I think, for example, I've sometimes wondered what deep insights we've really learned about the world. Maybe lies and deceptions are now as abundant as oxygen, even when filtered through a medical mask. Wow. As part of the intellectual self-defense I'd like to help the audience construct, I want to frame this talk with some wisdom offered by Jesus. For by your own words will you be acquitted, and by your own words will you be condemned. As a linguist, I think words matter. They aren't merely sounds emanating from our mouths, but the key signs of the condition of our hearts and minds. I think this will become clear when we look more closely at some of the sounds we hear coming from those who push the transhumanist agenda. And I've asked many people over the past 5 years what they think transhumanism is. And most people, they don't know, even extremely well-educated ones. Yeah. Some people mistake it for transgenderism and immediately start talking about, somebody's, preferred pronouns. And when we imagine transhumanism, however, I think you can say it's definitely related on one hand to transgenderism. I'm reminded of an interview about a year ago when the famous gatekeeper of the political establishment, Neil deGrasse Tyson, appeared on the podcast Trigonometry. Right. He was in this kind of heated debate with the hosts. Well, I would say maybe instead browbeating them. Not really debating. Tyson deployed the logical fallacy known as the appeal to common practice to bolster the practice and the normalization of men with gender dysphoria to compete in women's sports. He argued that we're in a transition period. We have to figure that out. Now, it seems to me this proposition represents an important insight about Tyson and his colleagues. They verbalize perversions of logic with such confidence that they sound like well-compensated ideologues. Throughout human history, there have always been two sexes. Nowadays, they're all actively creating new conceptual categories outside the male-female binary. The human male and the human female, like the autistic savant, are now being placed on a continuum. And never mind their intrinsic differences down to the cellular level, these biological categories must converge. And maybe we don't notice the move toward posthumanism because of the larger gaslighting campaign, the deletion of key words denoting key biological processes peculiar to women and men. We've written about this quite a bit before in our 4-part series on transhumanism in Propaganda in Focus. If you'd like to check it out, just visit Propaganda in Focus. I think the original definition in the Oxford English Dictionary of gender refers to work in descriptive linguistics to make categories for the divisions of various pronouns representing the two sexes, male and female. Just a quick side note, wherever English is the common currency in the world, it seems to me today that it's become perfectly acceptable to try to erase these kind of basic conceptual categories, especially when they contain like prototypical traits of what women are and men are and what they tend to do. Of course, some languages like French and Spanish have gendered nouns. If I recall correctly, knife is a masculine noun, and no, knife is a masculine noun, and fork is a feminine noun. I think I've got that right. It might have been John Money in the 1960s who was the first to try to separate concepts of gender from linguistics and to try to connect these to emerging concepts of the gender role and gender identity. It doesn't seem terribly difficult to re-engineer society to take on board these new concepts. Of course, it has taken some decades, but here we are today. Maybe it was in the 1960s, maybe this was the historical point at which increasing confusion over language and personality and personal identity, sexuality, and social roles was born. It seems to make sense. If you want to destroy human beings, human culture, healthy concepts of self, of family, of human reproduction, human community, society, nation, you've got to begin by disrupting the language and to separate shared meanings from empirical realities. Massive and sustained propaganda campaigns are needed to disrupt the language and reasoning. It thus follows that we'll take part in disrupting ourselves. It is through the debasement of language that everything can be inverted. It's why, it seems to me, some people believe that men can menstruate and have babies. There's a profound and yet simple insight in the book of Genesis, often either ignored or ridiculed, that defines humans as images of God. It claims that both male and female were made as a reflection of God on earth. Erase the categories, and you blur our understanding of how God works through us humans as image bearers. You might recall that time in the recent past when a certain Joe Biden nominee to the US Supreme Court either couldn't or wouldn't define what a woman is. And so with the basic conceptual category of woman undermined, men could more easily occupy public spaces reserved for women, thus the material manifestation of fundamentally crooked concepts. It seems to me during those confirmation hearings, this was the point at which we all witnessed the flawed logic of John Money's argument play out.
Yes.
Herbert Schiller, communications theorist, wrote about this process quite extensively, calling it definitional control. One useful way of controlling humans, the unpredictable creatures we are, is controlling the definitions of key words and concepts. If those at the top of the social, political, economic, and ecclesiastical order can control the definitions, enforce the meanings through speech codes, coercion, and new language norms, it's easy to wield greater control over thought, speech, and behavior. Probably agree. Think of Orwell's ideas about newspeak. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is truth. I'll return to that one, war is peace, a little bit later. So, question is, how do we accomplish it? Schiller wondered. How do the people at the very top of this order, this pyramid, accomplish this sort of control? It is through routine and easy access to what he called the informational infrastructure. Since they own it, easy access means they can easily influence the salience of a key concept, name, or definition, and we, the consuming public, ingest it all. What amazes me is the description that Paul the Apostle gave to this incredibly influential force at work in the world, the prince of the power of the air. What a curious name for a power center understood thousands of years ago, before the airwaves became controlled, commodified, and made into the primary vehicle of mass communication today. Of course, not everyone has access to the airwaves, but if you do, and say something that conflicts with the official political reality, then you're censored, or worse, you're canceled. The millions of miles of fiber optic cables, the satellite dishes, satellites, all the major corporate brands and channels of broadcast, and the means by which to frame the stories, bound debate, and make salient in the public consciousness what to think, how to think, and what to say or not to say. This power, this is in the ability to shape the most basic level of consciousness, is really in the hands of just a few. Hence, the ignorance, seems to me, of transhumanism. Because we're naturally drawn to systems of power and authority as social creatures, we naturally turn, in this age of mass communication, to media and media personalities whose roles are to fill our heads with the stories we crave as adults. It turns out, kind of interesting, the first communications networks were us forming in the womb, developing and beginning to perceive the voices of our mother. Research in developmental psychology shows that language regions in the brain responsible for hearing begin developing at about 7 months gestation. As the social network expands outside the mother-child dyad to family, and then to community and society, we find psychological liberation in asserting our own voices as we break free from our mothers and gravitate to other storytellers who might confirm or challenge our values or biases. I just try to imagine for a second when the transhumanist plan comes to pass and human mothers are cut out of the reproduction cycle, with synthetic babies being incubated and grown in synthetic wombs. This is no joke. It sounds patently absurd, but it's in the cards. They really do plan to dispossess humans of the desire and the ability to procreate. And this might be why the engineered issue over gender is becoming more and more instrumental.
Yes.
Hardcore gaslighting is needed to bring women, actual females born of human mothers, into the transhumanist plan of despising their own natural powers of reproduction. Now, what sorts of linguistic code do you think babies developed by the state will be exposed to in the man-made, state-approved uterus? Notice now how women have been gaslighted over the past 10 years and conditioned to adopt new words for practices traditionally associated with females. I don't think we generally are prepared mentally to take on board the absolutely crazy ideas being pushed by the centers of power regarding the transhumanist and posthumanist agendas. Lots of cultural conditioning is needed to implant unshakable, mistaken beliefs that human biological, neurological, and intellectual processes are fundamentally flawed and in desperate need of state intervention and transformation through routine technological upgrades. Those pushing the agendas want a world populated by people injected and boosted in perpetuity, and whose brains have been exposed to the experimental upgrades and rendered fully pliable. The sort of updating I'm referring to is really just code for the unspoken desire to live forever. As described in the Proteus monograph I talked about in a previous interview, the obedient to this regime will be sufficiently freaked, geeked, and tweaked. That is, enhanced to some extent, but controlled. And this is where clever marketing and the power of the broadcasted image come into play. Maybe these are the primary reasons why transhumanism and the move to a post-human future don't really register in the collective consciousness of the general public. Now, here's a bit of background. When I was in the military, working as an imagery analyst, we were often quite concerned about the quality of the imagery and how best to interpret the content. And so the tactics of the enemy would become more obvious to us. And sometimes the enemy would deploy camouflage so effectively, it became quite difficult for us to analyze and draw useful conclusions about what we were seeing. In other words, deception, camouflage, and cover are all elemental to the ways in which the enemy tricks and deceives. And fortunately for us, analysis never proceeds in a vacuum. We can also focus on understanding the picture, the imagery in light of the maps we have on hand to help us see how the enemy is able to contrive various deceptions. And this focus is only one aspect of the complex picture we'd interpret in times of war. Yesterday, we had really good maps, literally good cartographic representations of Earth. But today, we have on hand lots of really good maps too, but in the form of government white papers, published policies, public lectures, scholarly articles, and other communications that reveal so much about the transhumanist shift into a post-human world. Now, anyone interested in understanding who's pushing transhumanism can easily examine what I'm calling maps here to conduct their own all-source analysis. As I'm sure everyone knows already, lots of fearless scientists and physicians describe the present age as global warfare, and the deadliest weapons effectively rendered unrecognizable. So I think we ought to do all we can to uncover and expose the weaponry. The question is, why do the weapons of this paradigm shift remain largely hidden? One reason, it seems to me, is that corporate media are invested in hiding them and the damage they do. We refer to them as legacy media nowadays because their collapse is imminent and their legacy one of wanton disregard for human welfare.
Right.
Another problem is that there's too much information. Since we're constantly on sensory overload, the energy costs of focusing and putting things in their proper perspectives and mental categories are too high. The images presented to us in media, for example, represent only a small slice of a really complex intelligence picture.
Yes.
I think if we want to understand a complex problem like transhumanism, we've got to turn to multiple sources in different areas of knowledge. You'd probably agree.
Right. Yeah.
Consider, for example, the visual messaging presented for public consumption in 2015 when Klaus Schwab, sitting on a talk show hosted by Charlie Rose, was discussing the key ID features of the unfolding Fourth Industrial Revolution. I think the term given to this so-called revolution, again, it's just clever code for transhumanism. It is couched, however, in a kind of hyper-rational sophistication. The definition controlled by concepts we ordinarily associate with natural human progress through technological development. Well, that sounds so positive. So what's the point of using this kind of coded language? Well, if you think back 200 years ago, if the steam engine was a natural consequence of human innovation that fundamentally altered how we labored, we should, as the argument goes, be mentally prepared to accept all the new tools and techniques now invading markets, bodies, brains, and bloodstreams. Think furthermore about the visual representations in the Charlie Rose show. There's a dark background suggesting simplicity and mystery and a kind of refined style. Two gentlemen are carrying on a seemingly reasonable conversation about an earth-shattering paradigm shift in society and economy. Charlie Rose poses a question to Schwab to prompt him to talk about this revolution. What's unique about it? And Schwab begins by contrasting it with the Industrial Revolution of the 1800s. Schwab says the new revolution doesn't change what you're doing, it changes you. Think of genetic editing. It is you who are changed. Well, this mantra is repeated over the years in various rhetorical formulations by him and others. In the interview with Schwab, the calming effect on our emotions as we view this totally natural discussion between two men puts us at such ease that it hardly registers in our minds that some mysterious force, the so-called revolution, is driving technologies into our bodies that will change us at the cellular level. Remember, he says that the revolution changes you, your own agency, your sovereignty as a human being endowed with inalienable God-given rights is effectively erased by Schwab's declaration. Furthermore, the visual aspects of this apparently normal conversation muddle the auditory messaging. The technologies are being deployed to alter something as basic to our uniqueness as our genetic composition. Schwab's grammatical formulation is a perfect example of how language can be deployed to make profound political and technological impositions seem perfectly natural, like natural forces, like wind. And by making the quote-unquote fourth industrial revolution the grammatical subject that quote-unquote changes you, he completely erases who is driving the changes, what institutions are implementing them, whose interests do they serve, and what choices are being made by specific actors.
Exactly.
Again, right? We're at the level of parsing sentence grammar to understand how the people pushing the revolution see our blood cells, our vessels, and our neurological pathways as open and easily accessible sites of technological development. In Schwab's description, this so-called revolution is cast as an autonomous force acting upon us passive humans, rather than what it actually is. I think a coordinated program of technological implementation by identifiable corporations, governments, and international organizations.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Seems to me a more honest characterization of what's happening might go something like, we are funding and implementing technologies that will radically upend human behavior, cognition, neurological functioning, social relations, privacy rights, and even buying and selling.
Right.
Now,
Yeah.
this more accurate description, it would promptly raise questions about informed consent, democratic desirability, and possibilities for resistance, both material and spiritual. C. Douglas Lummis discusses this process at length in his 1996 book, Radical Democracy. I'm sorry. He introduces readers to anti-democratic development, which he describes as the kind of development that destroys in the name of national security, or we might say today, the war on terror, or overpopulation, or carbon dioxide, or whatever other fashionable abstraction are marked by elites for the global racket of protection or elimination. And within this ideology of development, Lummis says, the power of the metaphor is that it gives the impression that projects being carried out under that ideology are natural, inevitable, and bring about the proper and predestined future of the entity being developed. This is quite profound. I think of the mad rush to destroy something in the name of some kind of developmental agenda, of policy or a plan, or maybe some investment or wargaming exercise. But those in relative power have rationalized humanity as excess, useless eaters who must be dispossessed of access to, say, food, the necessary animal protein to sustain life, who emit harmful carbon dioxide, and never mind its absolute necessity to life on Earth, or who are members of a vast and unwashed herd of pack animals that must be inventoried, tagged, and controlled. Those who go unnamed in Schwab's description of the Fourth Industrial Revolution are effectively admitting to their own membership and worship in the global cult of transhumanism. The common rhetorical tactic deployed by Schwab serves to obscure the agent who would rather remain concealed. Now, in critical discourse analysis, this technique is called nominalization. It's a rhetorical move that performs quite incredible ideological work. It makes what is essentially a political project, reshaping human society through technology, appear as an inevitable historical force. Again, it's just code. The linguistic equivalent of resistance is futile. You can't resist a revolution that's just happening naturally. This speaks to my earlier point about Lummis and anti-democratic development. Schwab's language forecloses the possibility that people might collectively decide that they don't want to be changed by these technologies at all. The grammatical structure itself serves as a form of soft coercion. Another reason is that these technologies are framed as necessarily essential remedies created for the common good, or social problems technocrats have been forever working, they pretend, to be solving. So, who's behind this global push? If we ignore the most obvious, the preeminent center of global power, the transnational central banking system, among the many government agencies, NGOs, and corporate giants working in association with one another across the world, the standouts are familiar to most people. And we've suggested this in our research that a sustained focus ought to remain for now on the military-industrial complex, DARPA, NASA. If you take NASA's purported demand for cyborgs in space exploration, it's clearly the logical starting point for any study of the emerging transhumanist paradigm. We examine the plans and processes for transforming humans from natural, sovereign creatures to more synthetic and controlled forms of life. As such an examination, I think, is relatively easy if we consider how communications and the design of material structures and architectures reflect the thinking of those in power, reshaping the world and the human bodies that inhabit it. Now, take note of how the technical aspects of transhumanism are conceived and pitched to the public. In this project, we will develop and investigate concepts for an Internet of Bio-Nano Things system, individualized medicine, and microscale industrial applications are considered example applications. The IOBNT is tailored to enable the monitoring and triggering of infections through a communication platform between nano devices in the human body and with external gateways. In this way, the IOBNT will support the transfer of data and to control information between nano devices and external computers. Now, when we think carefully about the question of why the social world is arranged in the way that it is, we can begin to understand how it is an experiment. The major engineers of society and economy have already achieved a high level of control over us, the subjects in the experiment, by controlling the mental frameworks within which we think and speak and interact socially and economically. Think about, too, the major media systems that inculcate the right values and attitudes, the approved ideas and ideologies. We are definitely subjects in an experiment. Now, some of us are vaguely aware of this, others completely disengaged. We can find many clues in the pronouncements of technocrats. Consider this definition from the Transhumanist Manifesto, republished by NASA. A worldview that seeks a quality of life that brings about perpetual progress, self-transformation, practical optimism, visionary solutions, and critical thinking. The transhuman. The transhuman is a biological, technological organism, a transformation of the human species that continues to evolve with technology. This view frames the transformation in optimistic terms, absent any hint of who funds the transformation or who develops the biotechnological organisms. It confesses to its own ideological roots. Again, more nominalization. The worldview, like a human being, seeks something, a certain quality of life. It superimposes all of the responsibility onto an abstraction, like, for example, natural selection or some other blind mechanism of chance, possessed of incredible creative power. Now, for those who dare to think otherwise, there are always the sheepdogs, keeping the flock organized, obedient, and moving in the right direction. Elon Musk has warned that we must merge with machines to avoid becoming like monkeys. And Mitchell Zappa, futures strategist in the Rockefeller Foundation and Chinese Department of Education, similarly argued in 2013 that humanity has no other option than to be dragged, kicking and screaming, to the precipice of a future involving gene therapy, artificial organs, synthetic blood and vasculature, and bioelectronic drugs. So, if we are witnessing a transformation as described by Schwab, Musk, Gates, Harari, and the other major technocrats and gurus, it's, I think, natural to ask, where are we now? All of these so-called upgrades I've so far discussed raise the question about what it means to even be human. If DNA, for example, is the code of life, what does it mean for human life that the genetic code can be tampered with? That governments are funding the research and development of technologies to undertake this kind of work? This from Moderna advertisement as the rollout of the mRNA technology was appearing. So, quite astonishing. Are we in fact entering a post-human world? If so, what does post-human even mean? Is it theoretical, practical? A philosophical posthumanism has been around for decades in the writings of all the major cultural theorists who declare humanism, as understood during the Enlightenment, is over. A posthumanism is also understood today in terms of technological posthumanism, an area that interests me, which can be observed in efforts to change the social, psychological, or physical composition and behaviors of humans through technological upgrades in genetic engineering or neurocybernetic augmentation. How can we know this to be so? Well, Pfizer, for example, announced in 2015 its partnership with Bar Ilan University to gain a better understanding of DNA nanorobots for drug delivery. The press release tells us explicitly that the strategic move sees, quote, nanorobots turn from science fiction to applied solutions, unquote. So the references to robots operating at the cellular level can mean legacy bioscience is imploding or being replaced. It can mean synthetic biology is integrating with natural biology and new forms of research and development and of human existence are coming to the fore. In a 2015 paper titled The Internet of Bio-Nano Things, Ian Akiildes, a pioneer of the IOBNT, and colleagues write about this quote-unquote paradigm shift taking place in communication and in network engineering. They note that working at the level of nanotechnology, it is possible to create objects based on the control, reuse, modification, and re-engineering of biological cells. This new net, based on living cells and organisms, forms the foundation of many novel applications in the military, healthcare, and security fields, where nano things can be easily concealed, implanted, scattered in the environment, where they can cooperatively perform sensing, actuation, processing, and networking. In November 2019, Anthony Fauci spoke about healthcare applications of this new technology, this nanotechnology, known as self-assembling nanoparticles, embedded in, quote, universal influenza vaccines as a novel method of provoking an immune response. Again, that's November of 2019. 6 days later, the very first report of a puzzling new strain of influenza came out of Wuhan, China. What's the connection? Well, it seems to come into a better focus few years later, in 2023 lecture given by Akildis, who points out that the bio-nanoscale machines behind the IOPNT are for injecting into the body, and that's going really well with these COVID vaccines. It's going that direction. These mRNAs are nothing other than small-scale, nanoscale machines. They're programmed and they're injected. We've written extensively about all these apparent applications, but what's most fascinating are the levels of denial that such a paradigm shift is upon us. The R&D has been ongoing for decades. Researchers hardly ever analyze a physical system in its original form. Rather, they build a model that attempts to approximate the behavior they believe they're observing in the system. And by analyzing the behavior of the model, they hope they can predict the behavior of the actual system. You know, we construct models because natural dynamic systems are typically too complex to serve as sites of practical and precise analysis. Now, all the fallacious talk in scientific circles of the human body as a machine, the brain as a computer, DNA as software, and vaccines as updates to the software reflect the poor conceptual modeling of the human being as a justifiable site of experimentation and upgrade. The reductive and mechanistic thinking that dominates the minds of the transhumanist technocrats is now proven to be fundamentally flawed. With a massive global cover-up of harms and deaths due to the past 5 years of experimental pharmaceutical application, I wonder if we're now seeing the complex and dynamic system we know as human bodies, brains, and bloodstreams break down. Have all the transhumanist models of a truly post-human future already broken down? I can't imagine how the truth about this technocratic war on humanity can remain hidden much longer. As they say, truth finds a way.
Yes. Wow, wow, was für ein Einstieg. Danke, Dr. Broudy, Dr. Professor Broudy. Das war gewaltig. Jetzt haben wir eine Grundlage für den Tag. Wir werden noch mehr in diese Richtung hören. Aber jetzt bewegen wir uns zuerst einmal in Richtung Aufatmen. Wir werden diesen Vortrag noch oft ansehen müssen, bis wir wirklich verstanden haben, welche Tiefe er hier berührt hat. Vielen Dank nochmal für alles. Tschüss.